Welcome to the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Levere, and join me as we talk to other knife makers and craftsmen about anything and everything knives. I've tried many times to put a finger on what I like about the knives that Steven Ramos makes over the years, and I always give up and try to figure out why he looks so much like an actor I can't exactly place, and why he didn't take up acting with his Hollywood good looks. I may have squirrel brain, but in reality, I really like everything about what he's doing. And what's crazy about Steven is that he makes incredibly good-looking and wild knives, which marry stone and steel together in a way that's fantasy, art, and utility all at the same time. He's one of those knife makers on my watch list that seems to have figured out his true self in knives from a very early stage. And I live vicariously through him and his lapidary knife combinations as he pushes the envelope on fit, finish, and material choices. Frankly, I just sit stunned over what his mind produces, and the technical sophistication in which they're executed. What's more, Steven's sheath-making prowess complements his knives, and is a perfect accentuation that tells a story outside of his knives and with them at the same time, which is quite enigmatic. Steven, it's great to have you on the Good Old Blades podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so I think that most of my experience with your work really has to do with things like seeing you on Arizona Custom Knives, like knives for sale, or sometimes things that get shared through Blade Show when you're at the shows, or your presence on social media, so Instagram and Facebook, with a larger emphasis on Facebook. Can you give me a little bit of a introduction to yourself, what got you into knives, things like that, so that way those who have not dug into your knife making journey on social media at least know a little bit more about you and your craft?
Sure. Yeah. Well, growing up, I always liked working with my hands. I loved making things. My dad, growing up, he worked for the power company, local power company, and he had a six-car garage that is actually my shop now. That he'd work on cars and stuff, and he'd like to weld and things, and he had tons of power tools and things. And my brothers and I would go in the shop and make wooden swords and wooden guns and just had the time of our lives just making things out of wood and whatever we could find. There was just my dad kind of had a lot of junk and things in the shop, and we'd kind of just take parts of things and make them look like lightsabers and swords. So that's kind of how I got started with making things. I just had this natural affinity to use my hands to make stuff. Um, and it wasn't until I was around like 22, 23, I made some other things. I actually made some Wolverine claws, from the X-Men movies, and that was such a thrill. Someone actually wanted to buy them after, and I thought, oh, that's really fun that you could actually make something that people want to buy after. And I thought, well, maybe I could make some swords out of aluminum. I had no idea how to make actual swords or real blades with real, martensitic steels or anything like that. But just things that were props that maybe I could make. And it wasn't until I think it was around 24 that I was at the Kimball Arts Festival in Park City. It's a fairly large arts festival, and there was a knife maker there among all the painters and glass sculptures, and it just kind of just intrigued me just to see that there was someone that was making blades. And growing up, uh, you know, I had a natural affinity for blades anyway, like most boys do. Just the idea of a sword or a knife on your side was so mystical and magical to me. So to see a guy that was making knives, as an art form was just one of the most fascinating things to me. And I feel ashamed. I don't remember the guy's name. His name was Mike something, but his knives were just these beautiful pieces of work. And I just from that point on, I was like, I think I want to try to make a knife. So I went home and I kind of told my parents what I had intentions for, and started researching steels, and I kind of opened up this whole new microcosm I never knew existed, was the art of knife making. And I started to learn a couple names. I heard about this guy named Steve Johnson. I heard about this guy named Ricardo Velarde, and I really didn't know who they were at the time, just that they were some knife makers that were fairly local to me. And I was looking at their work, and again, just was just fascinated. That there was this whole world that I didn't know existed. So that's kind of how I got into it, and just kind of blossomed from there. I just read more and more about knives. I found another knife maker that I took a lot of inspiration from the beginning, which was Jay Fisher out of New Mexico. He made gemstone handled knives and mirror finishes, and he did his own leather work with exotic skins and just the most beautiful pieces of work I'd ever seen. And then I learned more names like Gil Hibben, and I think my parents actually got me a Gil Hibben DVD for my birthday one year. I think it was just like an 88-minute long video of him kind of making a Bowie knife. So, and from then on, I just kind of built on that. I started to gain some equipment. I kind of used the machines that my dad currently had in his garage. He had a couple small grinders and then drill presses. Nothing specific to knives, of course, but that's kind of how I got started. Um, Started learning more and more about different types of steels, and made my first knife in, I think it was January of 2012 was my first knife with a 440C and stainless steel bolsters and some kind of red acrylic handle. And I had the time of my life doing it. I mean, just I thought that was the coolest thing ever, that you could actually make something that out of nothing that you could actually use, um, and it was sharp and was beautiful and was usable. And by then I was hooked. I mean, I couldn't stop, and it's just kind of branched out ever since. And that's how it got started.
Yeah, it's pretty rad. Were you were you conversant on all like the heat treating methods and stuff for different steels early on, or was that something that you came into later?
No, something that came into later. In my research before I made my first knife, I did a lot of research beforehand. I didn't just jump right into sharpening an old file, which a lot of people get into, which is a great way to start. I did a little more research than most, I think. Not that I was particularly well versed in knife making or anything, but I knew that there was a heat treatment process. I wasn't sure how it worked or really what happened to the crystalline structure, or what really happened to the steel, but I knew that it had to be done somehow. Um, there was actually a foundry called May Foundry, I think, in downtown Salt Lake City, that I would drive my knives to get done at. I would, cut a couple pieces of steel out of 440C, and um, I'd drive them down to the foundry, and they do them for a small fee and get them done, in about a couple days. So I didn't do it myself until, a few years later, when I finally saved up enough money after selling a couple of knives to buy my own oven. So now I heat treat all my own knives.
Yeah, that's cool. I started out really simply with a O1. I picked steels early on in my knife making that I could use this old busted down smoker at a rental property we had, and dip it in canola oil, which I mean it skated a file and everything like that, but it was not,
Hmm.
it was rudimentary at best, and they all looked pretty bad coming out of it. But
Yeah.
even still, I know, like when people jump in head first into knife making, there's a 50-50 chance that heat treating is the last thing that they're thinking about, which
Definitely. Yeah.
which I think is cool in some ways. I say cool. There's lots of methods for being able to make knives, and you don't always have to start with having an expensive heat treating oven. There is grinding files. There is really simplistic torch heat treating for different types of steels.
Hmm.
Like oyster knives or things like that that are hard use on shucking oysters, but they're not they don't need to necessarily be heat treated to a high Rockwell hardness. There's also
Yeah.
there's heat treating that matches the utility, and then there's also methods for finding steel where you don't have to worry about that so much. So, so you're up in the Salt Lake City area.
Hmm.
I mean, this Steve Johnson. I got introduced to him by sitting, I guess in front of him. I guess if from the main door at a Blade Show Atlanta. But all these people were coming up to him and taking his photos and everything, and I was like, who is this? Because I knew Steve Johnson by reputation, but not by face. And his wife, and his son were there selling knives. And finally, we were kind of twisted back around and was talking to him a little bit. And I was like, oh man, like this is the guy. Like,
Yeah.
you like yeah, his reputation, his knives preceded his face in that sense. But he's just a super nice guy. Like if you ever wanted to be inspired by somebody and get into knives, he's definitely like that gateway drug of sorts.
Oh, for sure. I also have his DVD. That was another one of those early DVDs that I got when I got started. Um, and again, him being so local, I'd always want to visit his shop. I think I actually did reach out to him a year or two into knife making. Again, not knowing really the reputation the man had. All I knew was that he was a knife maker and his knives were beautiful, but I didn't really know really the kind of stature the man was and is at the time, you know. So I think he said, I'd love to have you come down to my shop, you know, if I'm a little busy at the moment. And, you know, I was a little upset. Oh, I really want to see this guy's shop, you know, but, you know, now that I am a knife maker, I can understand why it's kind of difficult to have someone come in your shop. But yeah, he's an amazing man with some amazing work. I didn't meet him until actually a few months ago. I did Blade Show West, which was held here in Salt Lake City, and he came to my table and he says, "Oh, you're Steve," and it took me 2 seconds to realize who it was. The more I didn't expect him to be there. As far as I know, he wasn't on the roster. Um, so I was a little shocked. I was like, oh my gosh, you're Steve. So it was kind of a fun way to meet him there. And he was familiar with my work and feeling familiar with my name to some degree anyway. So we talked for a little bit and yeah, he's an incredibly nice man and very helpful. You know, I ended up chatting with on Messenger for a little while after. I actually got invited out to the Art Knife Invitational by Barry, not as an exhibitor, but just as a guest to see the show, which I hope means maybe he's interested in my work eventually to be at the show. But Steve talked to me a little bit about you know what to expect at the show and you know kind of some decorum. So he's been incredibly helpful, and yeah, his work speaks for itself too. It's definitely one of the giants of the industry for sure.
Yeah, well, kind of on that note, it's interesting to me with Barry Lehan's how much he moves around or like gets around because the first time I'd ever met him, he was at a fairly local knife show in Texas. That I didn't know anybody knew about, but he showed up and he was looking at my knives and things, and you know, encouraged me on the areas that he really liked them. And a newer knife maker in the public eye because I had been making knives for a few years, but not really socializing it too much. It was nice to actually kind of get some of that feedback, and then learning later just how like prolific he is in engraving and working with other knife makers. I thought it was
Hmm.
you know real cool. So it's good that you're getting introduced into the Art Knife Invitational because I can definitely see as I think that probably the Art Knife Invitational is one of those areas where it takes a while to mature is the wrong word, but to establish yourself enough in the industry to be invited as a guest exhibitor, and then as people roll out or retire in that group, to be you know to have the stature and the reputation to be unanimously voted in. So it's
Absolutely.
you know
Hmm.
it's one of those things where you know it takes a minute, and if you're able to get the eyes on you for that in at this stage and everything. I think that's a really great thing for future prospects.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. And you know, it was just a privilege and an honor just with you know to not be too dramatic about it, but to be even invited as a guest to come out and just see the show. So my wife and I went out to Vegas, and her sister actually lives down in Vegas too. Her brother-in-law is the works at the Nellis Air Force Base, so we were able to stay with them and make it a little vacation. And went to the Art Night Invitational, and some of the work there was just unbelievable. I mean, just absolutely incredible work. So, but to kind of hobnob and rub elbows with some of those guys was really fun, and I'm getting more into the knife making world, as it were, the actual kind of social events of things and the knife shows and things. It's also new to me. I feel like I've kind of been growing out in Utah in this weird kind of vacuum where um, I haven't really trained with anyone. I haven't, you know, gone in anyone's shop and learned anyone. I haven't done any kind of apprenticeships or anything. So it's kind of my first big steps into the larger world of knife making, even though I've been doing it for about 12 years, um, which by knife standards is very, very early on in your career. I mean, some of these guys have been making knives for 40, 50, even 60 years. So
Yeah. But at the same time, it's interesting in a lot of ways with knives because uh, if you go back like 20 or 30 years, a lot of the way that people broke into them is they either made knives in a vacuum and kind of stayed that way for the most part, or they went to shows and proliferated there. There wasn't the advent of the internet as it is today,
mhm.
and so if you want to get seen um, by the public, that you have to do shows. So it's a little bit of a difference in a paradigm in the world that we have today, where everything is online and people have websites and YouTubes and all things like that. But so, what was the first year that you went to Blade Atlanta?
That was actually just this past year. That was 2023. Was my very first knife show ever, actually. And we picked the big one. We picked, yeah, Blade Show Atlanta, which was a ton of fun. I mean, it was stressful getting ready for the show. I felt like there was a lot of expectations, which there should be. I think a lot of people, uh, there's a couple people that actually expected me to be there. So I felt like I had to have my best work. Um, so getting ready, I still work full time too. So getting ready for the show was kind of stressful and tiresome, but we had a blast going out there. I made a lot of great contacts. That's actually where we met Barry for the first time. So yeah, just getting out in the shows has been quite an adventure. And then of course we did Blade Show West a few months later, and now I'm getting ready for the Solvang show in Solvang, California. That's in April, um, which I was very privileged and honored to get invited to. So
Yeah, talking about rubbing elbows with the great knife makers. I mean, the roster of knife makers at Solvang are incredible as well. You have the Art Knife Invitational, which kind of has its own mix of makers, and then some of those also are in Solvang. But I think that's. Do you find that you've gravitated more towards the I don't know how to put it. Like the old school aesthetic of knife making, and those knife makers like mirror polishes and taper tangs and things that are more emblematical of the old guard of knife makers.
yeah, yeah, it is kind of an old kind of style. I think the biggest thing now is Damascus and a lot of satin finishes and things like that. Again, what I first saw when I started was the mirror finishes, and like I said, Jay Fisher was one of the first guys I saw. And at the time, I kind of thought that's what everyone did was the mirror finish and gemstone. In fact, remember talking to some other knife makers and so how do you do your gemstone handles? And they said gemstone. I don't do gemstone. And I thought that was kind of odd because again, at the time, I thought that's what everyone did because that's what I saw was Jay Fisher and some of the other knife makers probably has a couple stone inlays, but nothing on the level that Jay Fisher was doing at the time. But as far as mirror finishes too, yeah, it was a lot of the Gil Hibbons knives too were also mirror finished, and I personally like the mirror finish. I like that it kind of shows kind of the peak finish of what a stainless steel can be, and I kind of like the challenge of getting it to that level. Um, so yeah, it is kind of an older style. I think there's still a market for that kind of thing. Like any kind of art, there's niche markets within that, and there's still people that really like the mirror finishes and the gemstone. And I've pulled from a lot of Bob Loveless things too, like the tapered tangs and stainless fittings. So that's just personally what I like to create. It was something that I felt was actually quite simple in its creation, but difficult in its execution. And I kind of like the balance of that it was simple yet difficult. I mean, and that's kind of what knife making is in general. I mean, knives are unbelievably simple tools. It's a blade and a handle. I mean, how much more simple can it be? Of course, it's how you execute that blade and handle that really separates a hobbyist from a true craftsman and artist. And I kind of liked the kind of mediums I was working in, like I said, mirror finishes and tapered tangs and bolsters and stone handles. It's kind of the amalgamation of all those things that made the kind of artwork that I like to create.
Yeah, yeah. In researching for this interview, I saw there was a post sometime in 2016 about it was on Blade Forums, I think, about your the resemblance of work to that you have to Jay Fisher, because I think that on there's a magazine article where you were featured on it, and they were asking about like copying others and things like that, and I thought that you handled
Yeah.
the situation pretty succinctly. But how do you how do you feel about mimicry is not the right word, but taking elements of people that you aspire to or that inspire you in knife making, and then incorporating that in your work? Because I'll tell you, there was quite a few years ago now, I had made a scalpel that was it was originally the way that I came about the design was from a knife maker that was friends with the gentleman. I bought all of his equipment for his shop when I got into knife making, and Clay Galt was his name. He was a longtime guild member. I would go out to the guild shows and everything, and he was located here in Texas. And I think in maybe 2013 he had passed away, but he had a long history of making these caping sets for safari hunting and whatnot. And when I inherited the patterns from Clay Galt, Martin Pullen, and John Weaver, I was like, there's not a lot of practicality anymore for caping sets. I tried to sell them, the pattern set as that, but it just really wasn't going anywhere. Because there's not a lot of people that are going to spend $1,400 on a caping set. But I think it was like 5 knives, and they were all modeled after scalpels that were found from the late 1800s to the turn of century, World War One ish, right?
Hmm.
And the scalpels resembled a knife that it was a Hossam.
Jerry
Yeah,
Hassan.
sorry, yeah, Jerry Hossam, that he
Hmm.
made, and somebody that was so my knife came up on some group, and somebody said that it was like it resembles a Jerry Hossam knife, and they were like yeah, a rip off of him, or a poor imitation. And I was just like, hey buddies, come on. Like I mean, I respected Hassam's work, and he has his own style and everything, but the area where my design and his converge really happens by happenstance. It was not intentional, and I hadn't really followed his Hossam's bird and trout patterns a whole lot. This came from Clay Galt, but
Hmm.
like how difficult is that when you are respecting and incorporating design elements from the masters and whatnot into your own work to try to like um, educate people that's like maybe influence versus like try to make exact pattern copies or whatever.
I think the idea of copying and mimicry and knife making is kind of interesting. I mean, every artist can take something from someone else. I mean, it's Michelangelo did sculptures, and so did many other sculptors of the time, or sculptors at the time. Can they say they copied each other because they're working within the same medium? It's hard to say. I think the only time you can actually copy someone is if you take their exact pattern, exactly how they designed it. You make the exact same thing as best as you can, and then pass it off as your own unique work. And that's to me copying, which I've never done. I've never copied any Jay Fisher's designs. I've had some things that are definitely inspired by that. I like swooping plunges. I like recurves. In fact, a lot of my knives were influenced by Bill Luckett's recurve knives, and so I pulled elements from a lot of different makers. Um, I personally don't see any issue with people taking elements from other creators and making their own unique creations out of it. I mean, even George Lucas pulled things from the Dune series to make his Tatooine planet in Star Wars. Of course, again, I guess people say that that was a ripoff of Dune too. So I personally don't get too hung up on who's copying who or who's um, mimicking who or who's pulled from what. I just think it's interesting if you can make a piece of art that is beautiful and still unique to the artist's own unique flavor, I guess. And early on, my knives, I guess, maybe looked more like Jay Fisher's. Again, that's what I knew. That's who I pulled from the most inspiration from. So I thought that's just how I thought knives were made. Um, but as I kind of matured and gained other influences, I moved away from certain elements and created some of my own unique things. Again, for one thing that I do that's I've actually never seen anyone do is I do um, dovetailed bolsters on an outside curve, which I haven't seen anyone do. So it's kind of a unique thing. I wanted to make something that was totally mine. So,
Well, yeah, and I think there's those early interactions with critics, I guess, sometimes help mold us into areas where we do make very large distinctions in our art style. You know, opposed to the people who think that we're just copying others' aesthetic. But you know, I when I look at your knives, there's an evolution from your earlier knives as far back as I could look is about 2013. So you know, some
mhm.
knives that you populated on social media, and then now uh, there's there's a lot of file work and things that I can't necessarily say Jay Fisher was the only thing that I saw in them because you know I look at Gil Hibben and let me think Buster Warenski, some of those
Hmm.
elements that I guess maybe at the time you'd call them fantasy knife features, right? You know the
Yeah,
swoops and the sabers and those type of geometrics, but you've really come into a like the pinnacle of your own style and your knives now, where things are balanced out in a way that is more refined than what I would see in your 2013 knives, right? Um,
oh, for sure. Yeah.
and I think that um, that is an evolution or a progression from you know where you start and you kind of do things that make sense to you in your mind and then you progress and refine those ideas to say well what am I really focusing on, right? Like what about this you know the swooping plunges or recurves or you know working with stone or dovetails or taper tanks or whatever they are, what about that thing do I like the most? And then let me put a magnifying glass on that element, and then that is my kind of new aesthetic. Like I pick out the things that I like the most about you know knife making and patterns and design and art aesthetics, right? And then slowly mature into that where I can really hone my craft into the areas where I really do like that. And I think that that's what separates people who do like early mimicry in some ways to refining things into their own, because you look at a lot of people who copy the general designs of Loveless. That you know you start
Right.
somewhere and you use that as an inspiration, but then some of the most iconic Loveless style makers really you could pick out a Loveless and you could pick out their knives and they'd be completely different. Like they just have a different aesthetics that they focus on, and you can see that as kind of like a fingerprint on the knives that they make.
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly. No, and it's interesting too that there are so many loveless makers, and I don't see too many people accusing them of being copiers or anything like that. It's how a lot of knife makers start is because Loveless had such um, a distinct style, but they were so perfect for their usage that it's a great knife to start with. It's very simple, it's very basic, but it's so beautifully and masterfully done that I think it's a great place to start. And I think a lot of people do that in any kind of art medium. I've even seen that even stand comedians, will rehearse line for line other stand-ups routines just to get the timing right, to get the punchlines right, to kind of get the pauses and into their routine before they branch out and actually do their own stand up. Of course, if they pass that off as their own work, that would be, something different. Um, but again, when I started, it was okay, this is how you make knives. is you do dovetailed bolsters, you taper the tang, you should have a swooping plunge line because it's not just for aesthetics, it's actually a stronger blade. Rather than having a square plunge line at the Picasso, you actually have a curved plunge line. It's stronger. So those all made sense to me, not just from the aesthetic point of view, but actually from a functional and structural point of view, that this is how you make knives. And as I kind of grew and made my own styles and things and made my own changes, I branched out into my own unique style that still has flavors and elements of Jay Fisher. You can see some Bob Loveless in there. I've got some designs that are like a dropped hunter and some kind of double-edged fighters, kind of like the New York Special, but with my own kind of spins on those things. And I've never once felt like I had to really apologize or defend myself for having the style that I do.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested in what got you into the lapidary side or stone side of knives themselves. I mean, I know that you said it's a progression because that's what you saw, so that's what you did. But how exactly are you cutting out and shaping your stone? Are you doing it all on lapidary equipment, or kind of what's your process?
Yeah, yeah, all lapidary equipment and stonework is a whole other beast. There's sometimes I kick myself like, why did I do this? It's so difficult to do because there's times I just feel like my life would be a lot easier if I stuck with wood or my micarta or something. But I got into stone because for part of the same reason that I got into knife making at all was that knives and blades kind of, again, growing up seeing fantasy movies and things like Lord of the Rings and Dragon Slayer and the blade, whether that's sword, dagger, knife, spear, just had a certain mystique to it that was so um, inviting to me and so interesting that there was almost a magical element to having your own personal sidearm that is a blade. Um, and naturally, stone kind of had the same feeling. There's been lots of sacred stones and ancient stones with script and magical powers that were attributed to stone. And the idea of having a handle material that took millions, if not billions, of years to form, that had color and character and crystals and little fractures and little spots of quartz and hematite and things like that was so fascinating to me that it was just natural that I wanted to combine kind of that mystical element of the steel of a blade to the kind of magical mystical properties of polished stone. It just felt like it was a good mesh that if you could combine the two, you would have a really, without overselling my work at all, but almost like this magical um, blade, this magical sword or knife or what have you. So that's kind of how I got into that. Again, and seeing it on other knives was the most beautiful thing ever. I like color. I think there's a lot of very beautiful woods, out there, but they all kind of can stay in the same kind of color gradient. Whereas with stone, you could have reds and pinks and blues and greens and just, it just kind of encompasses the whole electromagnetic spectrum, all reflected in a natural material of stone. And the idea of stone being timeless and just fascinated me. But to answer your question, yes, there is lapidary equipment that's needed for that. So it's diamond tooling, it's diamond saws and diamond belts, and uh, everything has to be run with water, so everything's water cooled. So there's mud all over in the shop. I mean, I get covered in mud, every time I grind a handle, and it dries out your hands. It's a messy, difficult, sometimes painful work to grind and cut and polish stone, especially for a knife. But at the end of the day, when you've got it finished and you can see that glistening, sparkly stone, depending on the material that it is, um, as your handle on the finished knife, there's just nothing like it. And while there's many people that do stone, it's still fairly rare in the knife making world. I don't see too many stone handles. I see a lot of stone inlays and things, but it's still something that I don't see too often that I like to kind of put my stamp on and say, yeah, I do stone handles as part of my signature, as it were. And that's how I got into that. It's just um, so beautiful and fascinating to me. And the way I got into it too, I actually thought it was more difficult than it was. I actually came across a forum online where there was some just lapidary hobbyists, and they were putting, little cabochon inlays into jewelries and things, and just kind of like a hobby forum. But one person said he was working on a knife handle that he just took an old buck knife and took the wood scales off it and was putting on some kind of agate. I forgot what it was onto the handle. And I thought, well, if this guy's just a hobbyist and he's doing it on a knife handle, I actually make knives. I think I could do it. And again, seeing Jay Fisher, that I knew it could be done. So I did some research and I kind of jumped in with both feet, took out a small loan for a bunch of diamond belts and some small diamond saws, and kind of jumped into it. It was a lot harder than I actually thought it was. Even to this day, like I said, I kick myself like, gosh, why did I commit to doing stone handles? It's so hard. But again, it's so gratifying, and to have something so unique, to have this. I'm currently working on a knife for the Solving show. The handle is Australian Dragonstone, and it's this kind of sea green stone with these red spots in it. Just this beautiful, flowy, earthy kind of material, which again I think reflects well with the kind of designs I'm doing. I always wanted my knives to kind of have a very grounded in earth, as it were, kind of design. It's very earthy, it's very flowy, it has a very organic look and feel to it. So having a natural material as hard and as beautiful as stone just seemed like the natural progression for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I've there was a knife that you recently posted that you finished on January 8th. I don't mind if I butcher this, but is it Sylvanus model or Sylvanus?
Oh, my Sylvanus model.
Sylvanus, yeah. Yeah, and whatever the red stone was that you used in that was incredible.
Yeah, yeah. That was Cave Creek jasper. It's a red jasper mined out of Arizona. Beautiful, deep, rich red color that comes from iron oxides and some little reflective bits of hematite in it that gives it kind of little streaks of this metallic look to it. Very beautiful stone, and I like that deep, rich red color. Red's my favorite color, so naturally at every show I gotta have one knife handle that's got red in it.
Yeah. Well, one thing I really like about your aesthetic too is when you're using stone, there's no visible pins on a bunch of knives that I've seen. Are they like
Hmm.
indexed with hidden pins on the inside, or how exactly is that being fastened to the tang?
Yeah, so how that's bonded is it's a combination of both mechanical and adhesive. So the dovetails in the bolster creates one type of mechanical hold, and there's also hidden pins in the stone, as well as a very high bond. It's actually an acrylic adhesive, so it's not an epoxy that bonds incredibly well to stone to steel. So after everything's bonded in place with the hidden pins and the bolsters, it is bonded forever. In fact, I'll even dry fit the stone before I put any of the bonding in, and actually got one stuck, and I couldn't get it undone. It was such a tight fit. So once it's bonded in place, and the good thing with stone too is that there's no thermal expansion, or it doesn't absorb oils or waters and expand or swell. So once it's bonded, it is there for good. Yeah, I've never had a knife fail with my bonding method.
Yeah. Well, I think stone as a medium. So when I was a kid, there were two things I really loved. One was knives, and by virtue guns, because I was getting like guns and ammo magazines and everything.
Hmm.
But I loved the idea of being a rock hound. I had a rocks and gems magazine subscription, and opal and a few other gems were just like I would just sit there and look at
Yeah.
these stones for forever. Jasper was one of them. Quartz I was really liked, and also gold in quartz matrix was really cool. Do
Yeah.
you
Hmm.
when you're sourcing out your stones, do you find yourself going to like rocks and gems type of exposés or stone meets or things like that in order to select it, or kind of how deeply have you got into the rock collecting component of that as it relates to knives?
I don't collect too many rocks. I mean, anything that I that I have that's rock related is meant for my knives. Um, I've even found rock sculptures or carvings that I thought like, oh, I bet I could slab that up and make a knife handle out of that after someone spent, 100 hours carving something out of it. But yeah, growing up too, like I kind of had a similar thing growing up is I loved polished stones. My dad would work for the power company. He'd actually have to go out of town to some of the other plants to work on in some of their plants. And on the way back, he'd pass through Wyoming and he'd bring me and my brothers home polished stones like some tiger's eye and um, unakite and things like that. And just I was fascinated with those too. And how I source my stones now is I've actually seen a couple things at some uh, rock shows and there's lots of um, jewelry stores that actually will sell stone slabs. I've actually had a couple slabs purchased at um, high-end jewelry stores in Park City. Um, they're kind of all over the place. There's even people that sell big slabs on eBay. The biggest issue with stone handles, at least for the handle sizes that I'm doing, is you need a big enough piece of rock to get both sides of the handle, or you can, if you can, find multiple pieces of the same stone enough to get a handle out of,
Uh,
which can be difficult to find big enough pieces.
yeah. Well, I mean, when you posted up your most recent work with that dragonstone or whatever, I saw it just barely fit.
Uh, yeah, I've had that stone in my inventory for a while, and I can't seem to find any more pieces of it that are a good enough size that have a good enough pattern too. Which again, as a side note, which is another very fascinating thing about the stone. Sometimes I find a piece of stone for a handle, and I can never find it ever again, which makes that particular knife I made the handle with totally unique. I mean, even if I made that same model again, that one knife I did with whatever stone, whether it's a jasper agate or a sodalite or a lapis lazuli or malachite, whatever it is, if I can't find that same pattern again or even that same stone ever again, well, that knife kind of has its own unique value that it wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah,
So
yeah, I really like Labradorite too.
yeah.
I've seen was Stefano Nardelli, I'm butchering his name, I'm sure, in Italy,
Hmm.
has done a lot with stone in his own pocket knife craft and whatnot, and it's interesting to me. I mean, the upfront cost to be able to work with stone is a lot higher. But man, I think that's probably the reason why I haven't done it. I've always wanted to, but I haven't really incorporated it in because of the additional equipment and space that I have to have. It's the same reason why I don't do my own engraving yet.
Right.
But man, I don't know. There's so many options, and it's just like every piece of stone does tell its own story. It's the same way with people who put meteorite in their blades or whatever, whether they're inlaying them or incorporating them into the steel, if they can do it. But all the different fossilized stones and things, and each type of mineral with their content also has its own challenges with how you work it because some are more brittle or finicky than others. Um,
Right.
I don't. There's a portion of me that thinks that maybe I would pull my hair out, especially if I had this really nice looking piece of stone and then somehow botched it or cracked it or something. I'd just be like, oh man,
Oh, I've definitely had my fair share of
I don't.
those. Yeah, I've had some beautiful, beautiful slabs, and I go to cut it out and make the knife, and there's a pocket or a void. Sometimes they're called bugs that are in the stone that you didn't know about until you cut into it and you start grinding on it. And um, I haven't had it since, but there was one knife I was working on for a client, and I got the stone too hot, and it cracked, and the whole knife is now ruined. Because it was actually bonded in place, but the stone cracked. Um, which isn't to say that stone is fragile. I mean, a lot of people think it's like glass, and as soon as you touch it, it's gonna shatter, which isn't the case. Some stone, yes, is more fragile than others, and some stones can be crumbly. Some stones are soft. Some stones can actually bend a little bit, depending on the its mineral composition. But stone is incredibly finicky, and not every stone polishes the same way. Some stones can take a glass-like polish. Some stones can take kind of a glossy, shiny polish, and some stones won't polish at all, and it just kind of looks like you're polishing a turd on your handle. So it's yeah, it's definitely fascinating to work with stone, but it's as equally frustrating. Another common thing that happens with polishing stone is when you get a stone that undercuts. Is to say that there's minerals that are harder, some minerals that are harder than other minerals in there. So you actually will get kind of an orange peel effect where some of the softer material gets polished out and the hard material is left on the surface. So you get kind of an orange peel effect, which kind of ruins the whole aesthetic that you're going for. And you have to kind of figure out ways around those polishing pitfalls. So it's incredibly frustrating. But if you can pull it off, again, like to have a polished stone that's cool to the touch, that just is smooth as glass, and it feels different in your hand. There's a weight to it. There's a kind of a an earthiness to it that just feels different when you hold it in your hand. Which again is something that attracted me to doing stone in the first place.
Yeah. Well, one thing I noticed. So you made reference to Lucasfilms. You made reference to Dune. You made reference to. Well, I saw that you made your own lightsaber. In 2016. Are
Uh-huh.
you a big fantasy buff, or like kind of is that part of something that you do in your free time?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean that's it's been part of the impetus with Knives at All was again having that mystique of the blade, of the sword. Like Gandalf had Glamdring, and in the Hobbit books, Thorn Oakenshield has Orcrist. They all had names. That was part of my my attraction to knife making at all was my basis in fantasy novels and fantasy movies. So I was currently re-listening to Lord of the Rings again in my shop. I have an audiobook where I'm listening to Lord of the Rings while I'm working on knives. So yes, definitely that's been a big impact on me personally in my life as well as in my knife making.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm pretty well read, I guess. I mean, I've read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and try to pick up fantasy novels here and there. There's a there is a book series by Jim Butcher called the Dresden series. I don't know if you've heard
Hmm.
of it, but
I've heard of them. I've not read them
oh,
though.
dude, they're all really good books. Not only is he a phenomenal writer, but one thing that's interesting about like the wizarding world, as it were, with the Dresden Files is he makes a lot of his own implements for magic, basically. And I always thought that
Hmm.
that was super cool. Basically, the mechanisms for like what these things do, these natural elements, and how they kind of channel magic and stuff. So if you ever get the opportunity, um, uh, Jim Marsters, he has read all of his books into audiobooks, and that they're like phenomenal reads, whether they're audiobooks or whether you're reading the actual books. And I would highly recommend it. It's just it's I think it's right in that same kind of vein of what you're
Hmm.
exposing yourself to, and the kind of the fantasy side of it.
Oh, I'd definitely like to check that out. Yeah, it's funny too. Like I've actually been currently reading a book as I'm designing a knife, not at the same time, but like kind of if I'm reading a book or listening to a book and I'm, while I'm in a design process for a knife, I actually will take elements from what I'm reading or name knives after things in the book. Again, I was reading Dune at the time when I was designing a couple new knives that I actually named Caladan and Atreides and Stilgar, and so all characters and elements from the book. So that's kind of how I've even named some of my models. And I kind of wanted something that was aggressive. I was reading Dune at the time. They talked about the Chris knife, made out of a one of the sandworms tooths, and I was like, I want a knife that's kind of aggressive. I'm kind of reading this book, so I came up with these harpoon style knives that kind of had these what I thought were kind of Dune elements that I incorporated. So yeah, to kind of answer your question further, that's yeah, some of the fantastical elements from books and things have kind of influenced me as a knife maker. And
Yeah, well, and I see that in your aesthetic. I think that that's part of like the evolution of what I see in your knives is this the flow, right?
hmm.
Like you can tell when somebody's eye is towards, I don't know, like elven knives or whatever. Like they kind of have this description in Tolkien and other things
Yeah.
where they flow, and they do lend themselves to the kind of aesthetic that you have. And I could definitely see that. Like some of your knives, I could just as easily see them being a prop or a homage to Tolkien's universe of elven blades and whatnot too. So I think that's pretty rad.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, a lot of them aren't actually intentional. It's just kind of how my designs kind of turn out as I make them. Although I think it's kind of a subconscious element that's in there that I like things that flow. Again, as I described earlier, I wanted my knives to have a very organic feel to them. There's a flow. I mean, there's kind of that balance between straight lines and curved lines. There's not a whole lot of straight lines on my knives at all anyway, but I like things that are curvy, things that are have flow and kind of swoop. And I think every knife I have is a recurve. I love the recurves. Um, and I like things that almost have motion to them. They almost looks like the knives are in motion even though they're standing still. And th I think having the fixed blades too as my medium has allowed me to have some of those designs. I love the folding knives, but I feel like you're kind of boxed in. Your knife can only be so big. It has to be able to fit inside its own handle. It has to fold back into itself. Whereas the fixed blade can be any size you want. And I tend to gravitate towards longer blades, at least, much longer than the handle itself. And it kind of gives it this how do I word this? It's almost it gives it some kind of motion to it when the blade is so much longer than the handle, which ironically enough, and harking back to my nerdy stuff, um, George Lucas had the same idea with the X-wings that it almost had he wanted this particular look to of the those spaceships to look like a race car driver, like a almost like a funny car, that it has this very long nose and it kind of gives it more of a sleek, um, fast looking. Uh, Design element to it, and I kind of want to incorporate that in my knives. So you'll notice that most of my blades kind of have a very long, lean, sleek look to them, which I personally like to make.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think that it's interesting how um, art imitates life in that way. Because if you think of Formula One cars and the aerodynamics of it, there's an underlying flow of air that makes those the most preferable design for the speeds and control and stuff that they want.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
so like that's what I when I was talking earlier about hyper focusing on a certain type of aesthetic. It's like you see something that you want to express in the medium of knives or whatever, and when you drill down far enough to that, you really you embody life and these natural elements, what like the evocative nature of knives and art in general is sometimes specific enough where people might not be able to put their finger on it, what exactly it is that they like
Hmm.
about that, or how it makes it flow the way that it does, but it does it right. I was talking with Delana about that on a recent episode, and that's basically the kind of the concept. Like when I look at your knives, they do flow. Uh, they just are visually appealing. There's nothing that I see in your knives that I do not like about them. It's not the proportions, the finish, the materials, the you know just everything about them to me is yummy, right? It looks delicious to my eyes,
Oh, thank you,
and
thank you.
well, that's something that in the time that I've been following you, it's been several years now that I've seen your work. But that's one of the reasons why I wanted to get you on here and talk a little bit about it, because like it's to me it's very appealing, and then to be able to talk to you about those and how you consider them. One thing that I really have enjoyed is your leather working,
Hmm.
because even though I really appreciate your knives and your knife aesthetic, your sheaths add a completely different element that is also complementary to your knife aesthetic. Even down to when you're doing, I guess it's you're doing kydex sheaths and things like what you've done with your flat sheaths and whatnot has been really appealing to me, as well as what you've done in complement to your knives, your other knives that are more fantasy or artsy knives.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, I really enjoy the leatherwork actually. It's funny. There's been a lot of knife makers that I've seen and heard about that said, "Oh, I used to make knives. I can't stand doing leather work. I don't want to do leather work." And I find it quite enjoyable, especially to to make a complete package. It just seemed like the knife was unfinished without the sheath. And of course, when I first started, I had a leather worker, and there was a local guy, just a couple of miles away from me that he was a saddle maker, and out of the scrap leather, he'd make sheaths for me. I'd pay him like 25 bucks. He'd throw together a sheath. Um, but anytime you pass on an element of your work to someone else, you're bringing in another artist's vision, and it's hard to have that cohesive, complete package that I wanted to achieve. So I decided to do my own leather work. So same thing. As I started with making knives, I did a little bit of research. I kind of looked at some tools and things, and it's a lot less involved to make leather sheaths anyway than it is the knives. So having that basis of making knives, transitioning to leather actually wasn't too difficult of a transition at all. Of course, getting into inlays and things complicated quite a bit. I was starting to work with exotic materials like crocodile skin and frog skin and snake skin, ostrich. I mean, there's all kinds of skins, and they also have their own unique challenges for each one. Like caiman and alligator skins, are very, very thick, plated, hides, that can be very difficult to cut through and difficult to have inlays with, whereas snake skin is um, a lot easier to cut through and stitch up together. But yeah, I wanted to have the knife and the sheath to be a complete, unique, cohesive package, that I think it was even Bob Loveless that said that the sheath is the house of the knife. It's kind of incomplete without it. Um, so that's kind of how that got started. And yeah, I quite enjoy it. After the knife is finished, which is for me anyway, it's a very arduous process. I mean, it takes me a long time to finish a knife, especially with the stone handles. After you polish the blade, it takes a couple of days of hand sanding to get the kind of mirror finish I'm achieving. Only to then spend hours, cutting and grinding and fitting stone and then shaping it and polishing it. It's an arduous process to get one of my knives done. So leatherwork is actually a little bit of more enjoyable to me. I can do a lot of it inside the house. It's just kind of cutting things out, stitching things together, and I do have to run out in the shop and sand a couple of things, but leatherwork is a lot simpler and it's a lot more forgiving. I can do a lot of stitching while I'm watching a movie with my wife, so that's not too much trouble. Um, but yeah, I appreciate your compliments. And yeah, I definitely wanted something that was just as unique, just as aesthetically pleasing as the knife itself. Which is why I got into the inlays and things. And to I wanted something that as soon as you looked at it, whenever someone buys a knife from me, at least a custom one, I ship it out in its own custom box, and I kind of wanted the impression that as soon as you open the box and you saw the sheath and the knife there, just perfectly balanced and meant for each other, that you knew that you were looking at a quality item, you know.
Well, yeah, I mean, in the kind of knives or the kind of sheaths I was talking about is your kydex over aluminum. Well,
Oh, the Kydex, sorry.
yeah. Well, no. Like your leather craft, I appreciate everything you've said about that, because I mean that's one element of it. But like even though you have these like incredible exotic sheaths, even going to your kydex over aluminum, to me, I I look at those and I'm like, man, like where it seems so. Uh, it seems so easy, and I don't mean easy as in like easy to manufacture, but it seems so like rudimentarily it makes sense, right? When
Hmm.
when I look at the sheath, it's like, man, everything has a place, and everything has an order. But the contrast between materials, to me, does so well and lends itself so well with the knife that you make. I really like what you've done with your Kydex over aluminum and how you've presented that. It is in its own way with those materials, speaks just as loudly about your prowess in design elements and utilizing materials as your leather sheaths with exotic materials too.
Hmm. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that too. Yeah, the Kydex over the aluminum, that actually also, and I hate to admit this a little bit, that actually was inspired by Jay Fisher. Jay Fisher has, when he does his tactical line of knives, he does do Kydex over an aluminum frame. And again, that was the only thing that made sense to me. I mean, I see people that will sandwich, Kydex, with itself, but that has a tendency to bend and flex, and if you're out in the woods, you're running through the trees and things, that Kydex sheath, even though there's a knife in there, can still flex and can lead to some damage to the knife itself or to the person wearing the sheath. So having the aluminum frame, it made sense that you had a very, very light but very, very rigid kind of skeleton for the sheath. And it also gave room for the knife to actually float in between the two Kydex panels, that so the knife actually wasn't touching anything. The actual blade wasn't touching anything inside the sheath. But you also have the benefits of the thermoforming of the Kydex material. So you could have a very tight fitting sheath, especially if you had some kind of retaining strap or locking mechanism that kept the knife in there. But the blade itself was floating inside the sheath, so it wasn't touching anything. To me, that made sense from purely from from a utilitarian standpoint, that's the best way to do that, is to have the aluminum frame that acted as the skeleton. And the added benefit too is that you could actually drill into that aluminum and uh, tap holes for mounting plates and for retaining straps and all kinds of things. And I've even done custom orders for people where I was able to mount flashlights and you know other small tools onto the sheath itself because you had that aluminum frame that could be drilled and tapped into. So to me, that again, that's what made the most sense. And I also like to add my own artistic flair. I'll put liners in between the aluminum and the Kydex, kind of like how people would do fiber liners in between the handle material for their knives. So I would make them match. It's I can't help but make things match and look aesthetically pleasing, even though they don't necessarily need to be. Again, when I do a tactical knife, it just needs to be totally utilitarian. Um, but I can't help myself. I have to put some kind of liner, something that makes it, or something that gives it a little bit of flair. And I'll do that with the Kydex sheets too. And just as I do with the my leather for my more exotic knives, they have to match. They have to be a cohesive set. So,
Yeah, that all makes sense. So I know that you mentioned earlier on that you worked full time too. What exactly do you do for a 9 to 5?
I work full time as a security officer. I'm actually in a management position, so I help manage a small team of security officers for a private company, which is it's a good job. I enjoy it. I like to be in that kind of role, naturally protective, I guess, and that's been a good job. But all day when I'm there, I'm thinking about either my wife or my knives. So
Well, yeah, that's kind of like the next thing I was going to ask because I thought I saw that you worked in security and whatnot. You also got your EMT certification not a long time ago, correct?
yeah, yeah, I got my EMT certification for my security job. Being in the kind of corporate office that I'm in, it's good to have some kind of medical training to assist when people have issues, which is inevitable in any kind of setting. And then I had to renew my license just this past year, and that was kind of a hard thing to get. I definitely took some stressful nights trying to make sure I could get my EMT license. It's not like getting a you know um, a PhD or getting a real medical license, but it definitely took some effort to get.
Oh yeah, I mean anything in those kind of fields, well, especially in response to disaster or acute situations. I mean, you have to think in a completely different mode than where you can articulate everything out. And so I can't imagine the kind of rigorous thought processes required to be able to triage things and uh, know when to call it and kind of what you can do that's life saving measures and so on and so forth. So it's interesting to me that the because I work in cybersecurity,
Right.
so oftentimes I'm actually I'm using a lot of the same brain cells that I'm doing, like articulating in security and cyber and engineering and stuff like that, inside of the context of what I'm doing with knives. I'm a lot more technology driven than some knife makers.
Hmm.
Design websites for knife makers here and there, but the a lot of my time is spent thinking about knives. I mean, I it's goes without saying that I think about my family a lot too.
Oh, of
But
course.
I have been blessed to be able to work from home the last 4 years. But previous to that, I'd worked online or at home, or worked online or in an office situation, and it's interesting to me where if I could replicate um, the financial stability of working full time in knives, I would probably do knives. But working in a stabilized work environment is a lot less tenuous than being a full time knife maker. And I really, my hat's off to people who can do it.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Uh, but that to me seems like it's already stressful enough to make knives for shows and to do things like have deadlines, but then to do that every day and knowing that that's what's feeding your family and whatnot, to me just seems stressful beyond what I think that I'm capable of.
Oh, for sure. No, it's funny. I still would love to push knives into a full-time gig, and I'm getting a lot of attention now, and I've sold a lot of knives, and it's my favorite thing in the world is making knives, and I'd love for that to be something that's you know a bigger than it is now. But you still got to work full time, and it definitely is difficult to be doing that. That is to work full time and make knives. While I'm trying to get ready for shows and things. Again, I'm the Solving show, which for me is a big deal. It seems like there's quite a few really big time makers there, and to be invited was both very encouraging and inspiring as much as it is stressful to get ready for something as prestigious as that, while still trying to work full time. So yeah, I'll put in my 40 hours a week, as well as 20 to 30 hours in the shop. I still work out every day. It's definitely hard to balance. And my wife is so wonderful and so supportive of everything, but she'll have to say, "Hey, you need to take a break. You need to take a step back." So
Yeah, I get
yeah,
that.
just kind of a
Well, because
workaholic. So
well, yeah, and when you enjoy what you're doing, you can get lost in it. Like the other night, I was out in the shop, and I started later in the evening after our daughter had been asleep, and I was out there working on something, and here it is like 2:30 in the morning, and I'm totally lost in it. And I can lose 4, 5, 6 hours doing stuff in the shop if I don't watch myself. I could just get lost in what I am doing,
oh,
and
absolutely.
it's kind of crazy, almost addictive in some ways. But when it comes to shows, do you have? I mean, considering the large amount of time that you have in labor to make your knives, do you have a particular number that you try to go for on pieces that you're going to take to a show?
Yeah, I tried to keep it um between 5 and 6 knives, or fewer, if I can get away with it. I think for Solving they said they wanted 5 knives at least, which is kind of my max for the time frame that I was in to make brand new knives. I had a couple of knives left over from the past show that I could take, but as an artist, I want to push myself and do the next thing. I want to be able to show a brand new set of knives, especially when, you know, on the table that they're kind of one whole unique art piece. When all 4 or 5 or 6 or however many knives are on the table. Um, so yeah, generally I'd like to have five if I can make that. It seems like a good solid number where it can fill up the table space and kind of present a good body of work that shows different design elements and different unique blade designs. So that's what I shoot for. But even even this one now, I've got I'm almost done with the current knife, and I have three knives left to finish in the next 3 months. So I'm really pushing it there. But I think I can do it. But kind of like you said, you can kind of get lost in it too. There's been a couple of times when I've been in the shop for 10 or 11 hours, and my wife says, "Are you coming home?" Because we actually just live about 7 minutes away from my parents' house, which is where I've set up shop. My wife and I are currently in an apartment, so not a whole lot of room for knife making there. So I'll get lost in things, and I'll lose track of time. It's such a passion, especially though when you do have a deadline to meet that makes it the pressure turned up a little bit. But there's even
Oh
been
yeah.
times when I'm almost done with this particular step, or if I can just get this knife and clamps, that'd make me feel better to at least feel like I'm on track more. And hey, babe, can I just jump in the shop and do this really quick? And not that I ever don't want to spend time with her. She's my best friend. I want to spend every waking minute with her, but I also do have to get these knives done. So there's kind of that push and pull of trying to balance, getting your goals met and being there for your family, which can be difficult I imagine for a lot of artists.
Oh yeah. And I've kind of come to this. What's the word? Um, well, I work full time. I work a lot of hours holistically, and I I spend a lot of time uh, taking care of my family is probably the wrong word, but like I have a daughter with a heart condition. I mean, she's medically fragile in some ways,
Hmm.
and after everything that we've gone through with her and losing Krista and whatnot, I've really said that my first obligation and the thing that I want to spend the most time on is my family, and everything after that is secondary. Even work to some extent. It's like you have to be able to like cut out and not focus on work. For me, working from home, it's like it's very easy just to say, okay, I'm just going to sit at my desk and work on something off hours or whatever. But I've kind of last this past year, and with kind of with the economy, knife shows have not been like the greatest selling vehicles for me. And the so I didn't see you at Atlanta because I wasn't there, but the previous 2 years I was there, and I had thought about going, setting up everything to go this year. But I think that I'm pretty resolved that in my life right now, what I want to focus on is what is coming out of my shop that is not time based, but is like drive based.
Hmm.
So I can actually focus on things that I really want to do and less about trying to keep up with the rat race of selling and going to shows and investing in that because it's quite expensive. I spent an exceptional amount of money the last few years going to shows and maybe selling some knives and whatnot. So in my mind, at least, I think that I'm done with going to major shows very often, and instead going to very selective shows and as an exhibitor, and then focusing most of my time in knives on nurturing the podcast and also making knives that I really just want to flex a side of my creative mind that I can't do when there's a gun to your head and when there's deadlines to be made. So
Yeah, it's definitely more enjoyable when you've got the time to just create, just let it flow. When you're frustrated in the shop, you have time to step away and say, I'm going to put this down for a little bit. I'll come back to it tomorrow or next week or next month, even if you wanted to, which you kind of can't do when you've got that deadline of the show, which yeah, definitely adds some pressure um, to the craft, which can kind of lower the enjoyability level a little bit. I mean, I do love it too. I like staying busy. I like feeling like I'm working hard on things, which I am. It's an enormous amount of work to uh, just make the knives themselves, let alone like make sure that your travels all set and your accommodations are booked and everything. It's definitely a lot. And where I'm at now, like after doing two blade shows, we had a great time, we had a great response, but I think I want to whittle that down to kind of like you said, more selective shows. And I think with the kind of work that I'm doing, I want to stick to more art knife shows. Um, like the Soul Bank show. If it's a successful show, maybe that'll be kind of a yearly reoccurrence. And there's other shows that I have as kind of like my mecca shows. I would love to one day do the Art Knife Invitational if I could ever get good enough for that kind of show, or the Arts and Metal show. There's lots of shows around the country that are more specific to the higher end pieces, which I would love to break into more. But as far as the kind of a general knife show, which is what Blade Show was, which is amazing for a kind of general knife enthusiast. I mean, there's anything that you could think of, from forged knives to art knives to the latest manufacturer flipper knife, to balisongs. There's really anything under the sun at those shows. But I want to get in something that's more specific, and that is the art knife shows. So my wife and I, we're excited, we're thrilled, we're counting down the days to Solvang, which coincidentally is actually on my birthday. It's going to be April 26th is my birthday, and that's the first day of the Solvang show. So we're hoping we'll make it a trip. We'll just spend some time in Solvang, and we'll get to shake hands with some great people and meet some great collectors, and yeah, we're looking forward to that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I I would go. I think if I remember correctly, there's a knife show that I have that's a little local, like more local show. That's earlier in. Well, no, maybe it's the same time as that, and and we try to reserve the end of April because that's when my son passed to just not really be too busy.
Mhm.
Um, there's all sorts of like memorials to things that when you suffer tragedy, and but the thing about it is like one day I'd like to be able to go out and at least attend the show and be able to see all the fantastic makers that are out there. I do agree. There are a ton of I say not a ton. There are there are shows out there that makers can zero in on that have the specificity to the kind of craft that they want to be in, and that's the wonderful part about knives too. Is like Blade Show Atlanta is like overwhelming. Just I've
Definitely.
never
Yeah.
the times that I've been exhibiting out there, I've just always felt that I was trying to keep my head above water, and be engaging and kind of have everything that you want to say or express or whatever at the show, all hemmed up before you actually get there. Uh, and what we've done is Blade Show Texas is actually only about a 17-minute drive from us. Um, and so,
That's convenient.
yeah, it is. And so that'll be one of my staple shows. I don't know what else I'll be doing. I'll give it a few years to see if I reincorporate Atlanta. I'd love to be able to go out to Salt Lake and to the West show and just like look around and see because it's a different demographic and it's a different set of makers. I know that there's like makers that go to all three shows, but then it also invites some of those West Coast and uh, you know Pacific North Westerners up or down to the show, and so that to me is interesting. I think probably I'll spend more time actually going to shows as a normal uh, uh, civilian.
A normie,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. I'll pay the normal ticket prices. I'll get in the same time everybody else does, and just enjoy the culture of the knife show versus the stress involved with exhibiting. But I don't know. As of us recording this, I have a few weeks left to get some knives done for Blade Texas, which we'll see when all this drops online. It'll be pretty close to Blade Show Texas, maybe a little bit after it's been done.
Mhm.
But I go through these. phases where I get a lot of work done, and then because of work and family, I don't have a lot of time in the shop. So as it stands right now, I have zero knives done. But the knives that I make and the materials that I use, I generally need to make a full show spread about 2.5 or 3 weeks. Most of what I have set up is I grind out all my stuff. Like I figure out kind of what I want to make, and I grind out all of my profiles, and do ever all the heat treating and surface grinding and everything. So that way, what I'm more focused on is the grinding the blades and doing the handle materials and finishing them out in the last few weeks before a show. That way,
Hmm.
if I do get bogged down with like normal life stuff, I still have the ability to push through and get knives finished that are kind of in some state of being finished versus just starting off from, bar one and having to grind everything out, from scratch.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at now. I've got like I said, I had 5 knives planned for Solvang, and they're all heat treated. They're all hollow ground. They're all tapered. They've all got bolsters that are shaped and ready for pinning. But they're not mirror finished yet. So I find it kind of daunting to finish a knife and sheath and start from square one all over again. I look at this big bar of steel. I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't want to do that again. So having them a little more than halfway finished kind of gives me a good starting point. Once I finish a knife, like, yeah, just pull the next one off the hanger and just start hand sanding it and get that one polished and get the stone fitted. And so, but I'm not a big batch kind of guy. Again, my knives can take, gosh, they can take over a month just to finish one. And then just the sheath too can take about a week of work to get a sheath done. Um, so doing them in large batches is difficult for me. The most I can do is probably like 5 in a batch. Um, but having them at least started, definitely helps mentally than to, just see just this rock and a bar of steel and a couple, you know, fasteners just is a little daunting. So
Yeah.
getting it started definitely helps.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of the same way. Like, to be honest with you, even in big shows, and I make smaller knives typically. I don't make a lot of long blades or big buoys or drop points or
Mhm.
things like that. I make a lot of smaller, what you probably consider in the EDC realm of knives, but
Yeah.
they're like hunting and skinning knives that are more flashy in some ways. With sometimes they'll do dovetail bolsters. A lot of them are bolster work. A lot of them are kind of I figure out kind of what handle materials I want to work with. But if I make more than like 7 or 8, sometimes I feel like the ideas are derivative of that at that point. Like I'm doing the same thing but just on a different pattern knife. And so what I try to do,
Yeah.
obviously is not focus too much on using the same handle materials. But because of that, it's like there's certain handle materials and certain aesthetics or whatever finishes and whatnot that um, I'm pretty much like I'll do it one time for one knife for that show, and then that's it for that thing. Not a lot of like I love desert ironwood, but if I have too many knives that have desert ironwood on it, I kind of like don't like it. So I'll just like pick one material for one knife, and that's it for that. But there's so much like the way that you finish out desert ironwood versus the way that you finish out your micartas or even other types of softer woods or whatever is just a little bit different. And I imagine that's probably like the same kind of tedium of working with stones is that like they kind of even though they do behave as stone, they also have their own nuances that make it something that you can't just lather, rinse, repeat. Even if you do have the handle material in a quantity enough where you could make more than one.
Hmm. Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, like I was telling you before, each stone is so different. I mean, there's a gradient of hardness too. I don't know if you're familiar with the Mohs hardness scale. It's a scale of 1 to 10 that's grading the hardness of minerals. One being like talc, and number 10 is diamond. We know diamond is uh, probably the hardest material that we have at our exposure, which is why it's in industrial grinding operations and things. And a lot of my stones can fall between 5.5 to 7 on the hardness scale. So 7 being that's a fairly hard material to cut through and to grind and to polish. Um, Generally speaking, though, the harder materials tend to have a better polish. They tend to have that real glassy polish, which I really like. But yeah, it's hard to cut through, and it can be very, very tedious. Some stones, I did one. It was called the stone was Shattuckite. It's a copper bearing silicate, which is about, I would guess, maybe 4.5 on the hardness scale. Probably even softer than that, which is a lot more enjoyable. Some of it I was actually able to sand by hand with just some silicone carbide paper to get that polished. So, but some stones, yeah, are just such a pain to get through. But again, nothing beats stone as far as I'm concerned, as far as uh, the unique characteristics of stone and its overall value, I think. But it also does drive the cost up a bit, because you've got a, a small investment. Well, I wouldn't say small, a good sized investment just in tooling to do stone. Like I mentioned before, I use diamond belts, that are water cooled, which I had to modify machinery to have water pans and things to catch the water in drains and things. And just one of the diamond belts, was $150, and I've got like 30 of them in the shop.
Yeah.
So, and then there's polishing oxides and things, and little diamond polishing pads and discs, and so, um, but yeah, it's an investment, but it's been a lot of fun. But I can't quite remember what your question was. I started to ramble on stone there again, but
No. I mean, that's what we're about here, rambling and just riffing off of each other. Well, Baba Terzola had brought up jade carving, since he had
mhm.
started in jade carving and then got into knives, and I wish that I was of the mind to invest in that kind of stuff and had the space for it. But maybe in a few years, I think I'd get to a place where I can start really playing in that space. But in the meantime, there's artists like you that I live vicariously through, and can see the wonderful work that you do. And it's really been a pleasure to get to speak with you and have you on the podcast and everything. And I will be interested to see what your final set is for Solvang and follow you kind of from there. One thing that I try to do is make sure everybody's social media is linked to the episodes that we do. So I'm more than happy to share that out. And if you ever get the mind to have a website or whatever, just let me know and I'll help you out with that. Because I know I was kind of going through the internets of things and noticed that you didn't have one. But your
Yeah.
your work is definitely
We're working on a new one.
yeah,
So.
yeah. Well, if you ever need any help, you let me know. But it's
Oh, I appreciate
like
that.
definitely your artwork is gallery style, and I think that in photographs and in a website to be able to see that in more than just what you're doing on social would be really great. Especially since it's I appreciate that in your specific craft style and everything, you share an awful lot of behind the scenes type of stuff, which
Mhm.
allows me to not only wrap my head around the processes, but then also like deeply appreciate the level of time and energy that you put into your knives. But to be able to do that on a website and to have more of a gallery curated, I think that's definitely beneficial, especially with all the stuff that is going on with social media and kind of silencing knife makers because they're grouped into the weapons category.
Yeah, a lot of crackdown on that stuff.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. I think diversification is the name of the game with knife makers, especially anybody who makes any type of tools or implements of some kind that could be associated with tactical or weapons. I think it's definitely beneficial that people diversify. But I just man, I appreciate your time on here. Good luck with the show. And when this episode comes up, I'll make sure I let you know.
No, thank you so much. It's been my pleasure to be on. Thanks for
Yeah,
having me on,
yeah,
David.
absolutely. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Good Old Blades podcast. Remember that you are loved, and God bless.